related habit, whether it's about the rules, the deadlines, the number of days, things like that, or just hotline all the time. It's a great place to sometimes get some straight answers. Sometimes I get not so straight answers, but if there's no answer to give, if they can't give it, I know that there isn't a clear answer. I often go to the hot tip library at the WRA website, which stems from questions into the legal hotline. But they've been a wonderful resource. I often just want to make sure I'm on the right path, I guess, thinking right. And oh boy, I'm wrong all the time. I mean, I try to be confident when I'm pretty certain I'm right, but boy, I'm wrong a lot, or at least I could be wrong a lot. So I find myself more and more. A lot of times the general answer is easy to a question, but any specific situation, there's always a little nuance. So I guess I would encourage you to be humble. The more you know, the more it is that we feel like we know it all. But boy, sometimes the more we know, the more we realize there's a lot to know out there. NAR's Realtor Code of Ethics, review that from time to time. There's 17 articles or codes. I'm not even sure what they're called. Those are, but we kind of know what they are in the back of our minds. But it's not a bad idea to review those now and then. Speaking of MLS, put into place, we've got these pretty well under control. The delayed with the 45-day maximum that you can have it in delayed status or no showings until, the total of those two, no showings until, I mean, if you change it to active and say no showings until, the total of those two is 45 days. You can get an extension. Typically one extension is pretty easy. I believe it has to be requested from the seller, but or you call the MLS and get special permission to do that. But generally you want to shoot for 45 days and think of that as the max. Listings, they have to be entered. Two criteria: within 4 days of the listing start date. When the seller signs does not matter. They could sign today and the listing start date tricky because it includes so much more than you think that it might. Obviously, a yard sign is public marketing. A posting on social media is public marketing. And even telling your buyer customer about the listing is public marketing. Telling your buyer client is not. If a customer were to come to you and ask you specifically about that property, that listing, somehow they knew about it, then it would be okay to talk to a buyer customer. But how did they find out? Well, it'd be hard for them to find out. Typically, they would know because there's some public marketing that took place. But know that talking to buyer clients is considered public marketing. And even if you don't say the specific property, if you're giving out enough information to generate interest, such as new listing in this neighborhood, in this city, call me if you want information. And then they call you and say, hey, I want to know about that property. And then you tell them. You sight unseen offers. The reason this works, by works, I mean, the reason that a buyer can get in to see a property when it's still in delayed status after they've gotten a sight unseen offer accepted is because the terms of an offer trump the MLS rules. So the MLS rules says you can't see it when it's in delayed, but the offer says you can, so you get to see it. Terms of an offer trump MLS rules. Now, license law says that we have to see properties before we list them and before we buy them, or work with buyers on them. But there's some leeway on the buy side. On the buy side, you need to view a property, do your competent visual inspection before writing an offer, submitting an offer, unless you're not able to, or unless you're, I shouldn't say not unless you're not able to. It's more that the properties, no one can see it. So if you're not allowed to see it, you can still write the offer, but you should then see it as quickly as you can after you write the offer or after acceptance. On the flip side, there's a similar rule for listing properties. You must see a house in person, not by Zoom, not FaceTime. You must see a house in person and do your competent visual inspection before listing a property. There is no leeway on the listing side. And I've had a discussion with the legal hotline about this. They even called the DSPS back a couple of years ago when COVID started and said, hey, is a visual inspection or a virtual inspection okay? Where the seller would get on FaceTime with the agent, walk through the house. Would that be okay? The legal hotline could not get a statement from the DSPS saying that was okay. So just know on the listing side, you must see it. There's no leeway. On the buy side, there is some leeway, and that's why we can do sight unseen offers.
Tim, I have a question for you on the MLS rules regarding single party listings.
Okay.
So when did those have to be entered into the MLS?
They do not have to be. In fact, they can't be because they only apply to one party. It's not being offered out to the entire MLS. And with single party listings, you don't need that seller authorization to exclude from MLS form because it just can't be in the MLS. So with single party listings, you don't have to notify the MLS. You don't need that form, but that's for a single party listing. An office exclusive listing is different. And please never do an office exclusive listing without talking to me first. And I'll do my best to talk you out of it because that's just a fine waiting to happen. Just real quickly, what an office exclusive listing is, it means only our office is going to know about it, meaning you could share that information with other agents in our brokerage, okay? But then with an office exclusive listing, there cannot be any public marketing. So if you share it with an agent, another agent in our brokerage, that's okay. As soon as an other agent shares it with a buyer customer, you've now done public marketing. You now should get a fine. I mean, if try not to do things where you think, oh, I don't think anybody will know. You won't get a fine if no one finds out, right? But that's a case where if someone finds out, you will get a fine, which means you shouldn't do it. That's why office exclusive listings scare me so much, because it's too easy to do what's considered public marketing. You tell the wrong person, or you tell another agent and they tell the wrong person. No. If you're the listing agent and you have an office exclusive listing and you share with another agent the existence of this listing and then they do something wrong, it's your fault, because you as the listing agent are responsible for whether public marketing happens or not. So that's why I say, boy, if you do an office exclusive listing, I would very much encourage you not to tell anyone about it, because somebody else is probably going to get you a fine. At the MLS?
Hey, Tim,
So
can you
Stacy-
restate the question there? Because we can't hear.
Yep. Stacy is saying in person here that she talked with somebody from the MLS, described the situation, and the MLS said, well, maybe an office exclusive listing is the way to go. So with that, can you share a little more about your scenario?
Listing, they're not really ready for potentially that buyer, but instead of one party listing, something that I would still know that it's available. And tell them and maybe other people that were my clients, just randomly. So that's kind of, we went through the whole scenario because they got rid of that. It's called before we could do off-market listings.
Yeah. So a little more information on that is the seller is really not quite ready to do a full listing yet, but there's a potential buyer in the picture. So should it be a single party listing? Should it be an office exclusive? Stacy and someone at the MLS were saying, well, maybe you want to do an office exclusive because then it would apply to not just that one buyer. It would apply to you could tell other people about it. But still, you could only tell buyer clients about it. You couldn't tell buyer customers. You couldn't advertise it. And so I think once you open that door with an office exclusive listing, you feel like now you do have the listing. It's locked up. It applies to everybody. You just essentially you can't tell anyone about it except your small buyer client pool. And you're allowed to do it, but how do you guarantee that none of those other agents break the rule? And there's a lot of people calling the MLS today and tattling, and there's some, I don't know if I call them rule breakers. I'll just say there's some people who know right where that line is and they're always right on it. Maybe some it seems pretty certain that if first time you do it, you're going to get busted, because that seems to be how it works. So just be very careful. If you do an office exclusive listing, then you need that seller authorization form to exclude from the MLS, and you have to give a copy of the listing contract and that form to the MLS. And I forget right now what the deadline is. It's either 4 days or one. It might just be 1 day of within listing. But that is search, or you can browse through on the left-hand side. They've got a menu. That information is out there. So again, if even in your case, Stacy, if you get closer to maybe should we do an office exclusive listing, as a brokerage, we haven't outlawed them. We haven't said you can't, but I think there are fines waiting to happen. So let's have the conversation and dive into any particular situation before you do it. I think there are circumstances where it makes sense. We just need to make sure all the rules are followed. And there's a lot of them. I think the fines are like $500 a day or something, and they add up to $2,000, $2,500 pretty quick. So it's we want to do it right. Okay. Working with other agents, just some ways to think about it, I guess. Some agents are frustrating to work with. Some are wonderful. They're friendly. You all have the same goal of getting to a closing. Sometimes it's the clients that force us to act in ways we don't want to act. Sometimes it's the other agent's client that forces them to act how they don't want to act. And sometimes it's just that the agents are not friendly. Sometimes they're a bully. Sometimes they're not good at communicating. Sometimes they're incompetent. But keep in mind that you can't fix them, but maybe you can help them. Maybe you can learn from them because you know how you feel when they're acting like this. So be sure that you don't act like that and become one of those agents. So I guess try to take something positive away. Try to help them. Keep your cool. Don't make assumptions. I like to think, well, maybe if somebody's being a jerk or a bully or lashing out, maybe they're just scared. Maybe they're making a phone call to you that they don't want to make, and they don't want to get yelled at. Sometimes people huff and puff because they're scared. So just keep in mind that maybe their demeanor might completely change if you give them a hug over the phone or say something nice to them. It's amazing what we can get done when we work together, but oh boy, things can turn adversarial very quickly. So, try not to let it get to that point. And so often there's too much texting and emailing going on. Pick up the phone, have a conversation. You can accomplish so much more in a few minutes, and not lose things in translation like you can with the text and email so often. I like to think, I'd say things like right and wrong doesn't matter. Having everybody on the same page matters more, because being right only matters when you go to court. And the only person that gets to decide who's right is the judge. And I've never been to court. I've never even been to mediation, arbitration, any of that. So, we do our best to do things right. We do our best then to back it up and prove or convince the other side that our way is right. But I always like to think about being in court. Is what I'm doing, or in front of a panel for mediation, arbitration, is what I'm doing right now, or is what I'm about to do. If I have to defend this in front of other agents, my peers, or a judge, am I going to be proud to do that? Or am I going to feel like, now I'm going to get in trouble for what I just did or what I'm about to do? But so try to do the right thing. Try to think of it in that kind of framework. Try to do something different. If you start thinking things like, well, I don't think anybody will find out. Oh, that's a bad sign. And keep documentation. When deals start to go south a little bit, when there's a red flag, start taking more notes. I mean, you'll have texts and email records, but maybe make some notes on phone calls, because you may need them. And just a few days or a week after you have a phone call, it's really hard to remember what was said. Quick tip number 3. There's a few in here. You're being watched. We should all just assume, and we should tell our clients and customers that when we're looking at houses, we're probably being recorded, video and audio. So be careful what you say. Or if you're going to say something, use it to your advantage. It used to be we wouldn't want a seller to know how much the buyer loved the house. But that's when we were negotiating with the seller one-on-one. Now that we're in a competitive environment and we're trying to beat out other buyers, boy, a seller would certainly want to sell it to somebody who loves their house more so than somebody who's nitpicking their house. Sometimes it's better, to gush about the house. So if they're listening, they can hear how much this buyer loves the house. It makes the seller feel good, and it also probably makes the seller feel more comfortable that this buyer, your buyer, is the one that's actually going to close. But that's dependent on the market. Be careful what you say. Just like you tell your clients, customers, you're being listened to. So be careful what you say. Be careful what you say as well. When you're asked about price or other things about the property, do you have a buyer agency contract? That opens up your ability to talk a little more freely. But if you don't have buyer agency and you're not working for the buyer, you have to be very careful that you don't do anything against the seller's best wishes. So they say, how's the price? You say it's too high. Boom. They get that on tape. You're in trouble. So just be very careful. And again, the next question, school, neighborhood, how do we talk about these things when they're asked? The answer isn't let's go outside and talk about it. When we say don't, be careful what you say because you're being recorded. Well, also, and more importantly, be careful what you say because it's against the law. So I'm not saying go outside and break the law. I'm saying be careful what you say inside. Not that you can't say it, but there's certain things you don't want the seller to hear. But even when you're outside, no one hears except for you and the client. You still can't say those wrong things. The WR, or Wisconsin Real Estate Magazine, April 2022 had a fair housing article and quiz. I put the link in there. You can just go to the WRA website and browse to it. But it's just an interesting little quiz as we all we think we know what fair housing means. There's so many nuances to it that I bet most of us don't. Now, if you actually go in and take that quiz, well, some of the answers are pretty obvious, but the tip is in the answer itself. So even though some are silly answers and obviously wrong and some are obviously right, you still get to read through that and think about it. So it's worth it to take 10 or 15 minutes just to go through things like that. And that's why I say, as you get those magazines, those are pretty good. If you can take a few minutes and browse through and read one or two of the articles, you pick up those tips every month. Communication and setting expectations. As I talk to agents, usually agents call me at the hard parts of the transaction, the stressful parts. And a lot of times it's, oops, if I only could have done this yesterday or last week or when I wrote the offer, but now we're here. Or sometimes it's not even a mistake. Something's going on. How do we navigate it? And the question often becomes, what do I do? What's the best thing? That's a lot of stress to put on ourselves. And so often it's not our decision to make. It's your client's decision. It's the seller's decision, the buyer's decision. It's not our job to make the decision. It's our job, I feel, to inform our clients of all the options and the pros and cons of each option. And then they pick. A lot of times the best answer will be obvious, but everybody brings their own weighting system to decisions like this. So we can't make the best decision for a buyer or a seller. Make sure everyone's on the same page. I think that is more important. Just because you're right and something's written not clearly and the other side interprets it differently, even though you're right, that's not going to matter unless you go to court. But having two people think about something differently is going to cause all kinds of problems, whether you're right or not. So make sure, I'm not saying be on the same page and do it wrong. I'm saying, balance that with, yes, you want to do things right, but you also want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Don't hide behind, I'm right, you guys all need to fall in line, because it just doesn't work that way. Don't skip a discussion to save time. Oftentimes we're trying to beat deadlines. We got kids to go pick up. We're hurrying, trying to get things done. Again, when you're hurrying, boy, that's when you make a mistake. That's when you skip a conversation you should have with your buyer. You skip an opportunity to set some expectations. And fine, 9 out of 10, 19 out of 20 times it doesn't come to light. It doesn't matter. And that scenario doesn't come into play. But boy, that 20th time when it does, you're going to wish you spent that time all the other 20 times. Don't skip the hard discussions. And this kind of goes along with, try not to let a client bully you, or whatever word you want to use for that. Some clients and customers, they're harder to deal with. Now, our customers get to make the decisions, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be giving them our thoughts. If we think they're doing the wrong thing, tell them why, back it up. And if you put your thoughts out there and give your opinion and they choose to do something else, well, that's fine, but at least get your opinion out there. Contracts, contingencies. My best advice, and it's really boring, but read the offer. And the offers generally comes into play more than the listing contracts, but read the offer. There's so many things of why we do it, and ask why we do it. A lot of times the answer would be, well, because we've always done it that way. But the real reason, the reason we've always done it that way is because that's how we're supposed to do it, because it says so right in the offer here. That's oftentimes the real answer. Although sometimes the reasoning of, well, that's how I always used to do it. Well, that was right 20 years ago, but that stopped being the right way 15 years ago. But sometimes people just keep doing it that way. So just read through the offer or bits and pieces. You know, when you find yourself, hey, I'm doing a notice through the inspection contingency for the first time in 8 years. Well, definitely at that point, read all through the inspection contingency. Be thorough, but don't overcomplicate. I sometimes fail at this one. Sometimes I lean towards more thorough, more detailed, more covering every possible scenario, and it becomes overly complicated. I think contingency should be thorough enough to be clear and complete, and that's it. Nothing beyond that. But you have to find that balance. Don't restate or repeat. And what I mean by this is when you're doing notices or amendments, especially notices, the offer already says, if you send this notice, then this happens. So when you write that notice, don't say, I'm giving notice of this, and therefore this is going to happen and that's going to happen. Don't repeat what's already said in the offer. As soon as you repeat something, you change an and to an or, and it just messes things up. Same thing in an amendment. Be careful when you're retyping things. You know, if you're retyping versus referencing lines in an offer, for example, just be very careful. Every little word can have a drastic difference in meaning. Don't make assumptions. You've always done it that way. That's never a good justification. You should know why you do the things you do. I like to think with a loophole mindset. You know, where's the red flag? How could this contingency be used to get out of the offer? You know, whether you're on the buy side, the listing side, buy side, how can I make sure my client's protected? On the listing side, how could this buyer possibly use this to get out of the offer? And sometimes that's not a bad thing. You just want to understand that and set that expectation with the seller of this scenario could happen. Be nitpicky. I think, especially when you're reviewing offers, being nitpicky is good. Look for the ways things can be ambiguous. How could things be interpreted differently? Offer presentation strategies. But by this, I mean really on both sides. If you're writing the offer for the buyer and you're presenting it to or delivering it to the listing agent, I mean, the number one by far and away thing, make sure they get it. Make sure you get confirmation that they've received your offer. That's on you to make sure they get it. That's not on them to make sure you get it to them. If it ends up in their spam and it doesn't get presented because you just sent it and forgot it, well, that's on you. And I would say it's also on the listing agent. You know, I'd be on the listing side. It's not a bad idea to check your spam. In fact, it's a great idea in general to check your spam every day or two just to see if something sneaks into there. Cash offer, proof of funds. This one is wrought with, how do I say that? It's trouble waiting to happen so often because what we call cash offers often aren't cash offers, and what constitutes proof of funds or what's given for proof of funds often is not sufficient for proof of funds. So, you know, there's just because an offer doesn't have a finance contingency doesn't make it a cash offer. And it's kind of become a generic term, or if there's no finance contingency, it's referred to as a cash offer. And oftentimes it's not, and that's fine. Even a non-cash offer where financing is needed, at least if there's no finance contingency, well, a seller can be comfortable that, well, the buyer's not too concerned about their financing. Now, the flip side of that is if you're going to close 3 months from now, at least a finance contingency, it's really a finance commitment contingency. Because in 30 days or whatever the deadline is, the seller's guaranteed to get a finance commitment letter. So there is some positive to have a finance contingency. There is some positive to the seller because they get that letter so they know, great, after this contingency, I'll have my letter. I know they can get their financing. If there's no finance contingency, there's no requirement for a buyer to give the seller a finance commitment letter. So that's something to keep in mind. Just as you're writing the offer, just keep in mind what counts as proof of funds. Proof of funds ideally or essentially is money sitting in an account that you can write a check for. It's not a home equity line of credit. It's not even stocks that are easily liquidated. Once they're liquidated, then you have funds. Up until then, you have stocks. The value can change. So as you think about that, there's ways to get around that. There's ways to deal with that in the offer. Either provide your proof when you submit the offer and say, hey, here's what I got, and cross out the part that says within 7 days you'll give proof of funds, and just say, here's what I got. If it's not sufficient, the seller, the listing agent, can request something else at that time. But what you don't want to do is on day 7 provide your proof of funds and have the seller say, well, I don't believe this is sufficient proof of funds, and now you've got a problem. Or in the offer, you can specify, instead of proof of funds, here's what we're going to provide. And you can be very specific with what you're going to provide. So if you ever want to talk through that on the listing or buy side, always happy to talk about that one. Make sure you have enough time to perform when you draft contingencies. And this goes on the buy and sell side. As when you're on the buyer side, does the buyer have enough time to get inspections done, or well and septic and water testing, or what are the contingencies? What are the financing? Make sure there's enough time to perform. On the seller side, I would say the big one is make sure they have enough time to move. Make sure they understand that if there's a 30-day finance contingency and we're going to close in 32 days, they're going to need to start moving before we even know if the buyer is going to close. And this, I think, is one that doesn't get talked about very often. What if the seller starts moving out, or puts the deposit down on movers, starts moving out, and then on day 30, oops, no finance commitment letter, and the buyer says, sorry, can't get financing, deal's done, I want my earnest money back, and the seller's half moved out already. That's typically the way it works. It's not a big deal, but that's definitely a conversation you should have with your seller when you're reviewing offers, when the closing date is shortly after the finance contingency deadline, or any contingency deadline, just so they know you need to make this leap of faith before all contingencies are cleared. Okay. Review of your typical offer. If anybody wants to, or is brave enough to let me get out my yellow highlighter and red pen, I'd be glad to review any of your typical offer that you would write, or a listing contract that you would write. Or if you're on the listing side, if you receive an offer from someone else, I'd be happy to meet with you in person or over Zoom and just go through and give you my thoughts. Some things I may say, ooh, that's wrong, you really should do it this way. Other things might be, well, this is fine, but here's another way to do it. Here's another way to think about it. So if you want to sit down and just spend 15 minutes reviewing a document, an offer or something, I'd be glad to do that. Tip number 4, be the one to ask the question first. Don't wait for your client to bring it up. And what I mean here is, it could be you get title work, for example, and you look at it and something weird is on it. But you don't do anything about it. And then 4 days later, your buyer client says, what's this all about? Well, it would have been better if you brought it to their attention versus you sitting back waiting for them to bring it to your attention. Same thing with maybe a closing statement. Something looks funny on there. What's going on? This applies to any number of things. If you see something, bring it up. Don't just hope the buyer or your client won't bring it up. You be the one to bring it up first. It just looks bad if they bring it up. It feels like you missed it and they had to bring it to your attention. Okay, working with sellers, setting expectation is huge. You may not get 20 offers over list price, or 5 offers. You may not get any offers the first weekend. I think these are important expectations to set with the seller, that the market's a little different now. I know you've been hearing the stories. You still may get multiple offers. You may not. It depends on pricing. Just have that conversation. So how many showings can you expect? Sometimes we'd expect 20 showings over the weekend and you get 0. It's hit and miss sometimes. So just set expectations. and cash offers. Let them know that they may still have an appraisal and still get financing. This would be more of a discussion at the time you get an offer. Again, just because there's no finance contingency doesn't mean they're not getting financing, and it doesn't mean that they don't have the right to do that. It's right in the offer that they do have that right. Let a seller know that probably in an offer, if you have well and septic, the seller's probably going to be asked to pay for those inspections. Not always, it's negotiable, but I see that more than not that the seller would pay for it. This one just came up the other day. The buyer agent said, oh, hey, by the way, I won't be at the inspection, but the inspector will be there and the buyer will be there. And the question was, is that okay? Because my seller's got stuff in the house and they're very private and kind of weird about that stuff. And I don't think they're going to like that agent, the buyer being there without the agent. And the answer was, well, they have the right to. It's right in the offer. In fact, it says something like in the inspection contingency, the buyer and or the agent or both may attend the inspection. So it's something to that effect. Buyer, agent, or both. So it's clear in the offer that the buyer agent doesn't have to be there. Now, I won't get into my other rant about how can a buyer agent provide good service. How can they negotiate if they haven't even seen what the problems are? But that's a different thing. At this point, this agent, this may become part of his listing presentation going forward, especially if it's if he knows it's a seller that may be kind of particular about who's in their house. This may be a case of, hey, seller, by the way, when we get offers, we need to watch out for this because this could happen. And some sellers are going to say, I don't care who's there. Certainly if it's a vacant house, they're probably not going to care. But oftentimes even occupied, they may not care, but some might. And for somebody who does, if you're the agent that brings it up in a listing presentation and says, hey, we need to watch out for this, and we'll have more discussions about it later when we get the offer. If somebody else comes in as a listing agent and doesn't bring that up, well, that doesn't look so good on the other agent. Now, that may have no bearing on with some sellers, but it may make a difference with some who care about that. Pictures. Don't use other pictures. Don't use other agents' pictures. Don't even use Google Street pictures. Everything's copyrighted. And back in the day, that was more common. But my goodness, just go. Usually, older pictures are not so good anyway. So please take your own pictures. As is. When sellers often say this, I want to sell as is, and they don't know what that means. And we don't know what that means because it means something that you can know what it means, but it doesn't matter if the seller and the buyer and any other agent looking at the property don't know what that means. It can mean anything from, and I guess my point here is when a seller says that, start this line of questioning to dive deeper. Does that mean you don't want anybody to do an inspection? You won't allow it? Usually the answer is, oh no, they can do an inspection. I'm just not going to fix anything. Okay, so we really just want to set the expectation that you can do an inspection. We're just not going to fix any defects. You do your inspection and then buy it or you don't. That's often the case. A lot of times it has to do with, I'm going to sell it as is, so I'm not going to fill out a condition report and I'm not going to disclose anything because I don't know anything about the house. So I don't want to fill out the condition report, even though I know I'm not excluded from it. Keep in mind that the requirement to or exclusion from completing the condition report is separate from the requirement to disclose defects that you know about the property. It says right in the offer in the condition report section, basically, I, the seller, don't know of anything wrong with this property except what's in the condition report and the following. So unless that language is modified, when a seller accepts an offer, they're saying, I don't know of anything wrong with the property. And so a seller that says, oh, I'm not going to disclose anything, I'm not going to fill out one of those condition reports, that doesn't mean they wouldn't be liable if they're hiding something. Or if they don't want to say something. I think that's a common misconception that a lot of sellers can just think they can just say as is, So I'm not liable for anything. That is not the case. So if you get somebody who's doing an as is, wants to do an as is, feel free to give me a call and we can talk through things. Sometimes depending on what they want to do, we can add in different language to cover specifically what they want. Review seller closing costs up front. I think a great time to do this is during your listing presentation or while you're doing the paperwork. You don't want a seller to be surprised when they get the preliminary or final closing statement and go, wow, I had no idea these things cost so much. It's normal for us, but a client selling for their first time, they don't know about transfer tax or title insurance, things like that. So definitely the sooner the better, just to give some idea of what the closing costs are. Real estate taxes, the proration, I don't really consider them a closing cost because there's something that gets paid whether you sell or not, whether a seller sells or not, but it's something that gets paid at the time of closing. So I definitely would lump those in with the closing cost. And put your closing officer to work with you. You can just discuss closing costs with them, do a search and hold, the preliminary title work. Do you have gift funds or a funny name or a trust, or how does something need to show up on the offer? Getting copies of deed restrictions, all this stuff. Use the people you know, and the title officers, the closing officers are there to help. Listings. Square footage can be tricky. It's gotten easier in the last 10 years because so many assessors have it available in the tax records. And generally, we're saying the source is the assessor and this is the square footage. I would recommend that, make sure that seems reasonable. And really on the buy side or sell side, what the MLS is saying or what the listing agent is saying, they're not saying the square footage is this. They're saying the assessor is saying the square footage is this. We're only saying the square footage is this if we put listing agent as source. Now, if you think the assessor square footage might be a little low, or for example, the basement is finished and it's not in the tax records, which then, did they have a building permit? But measuring square footage, I think, is a lost skill. No one really seems to do it anymore. We still need to measure rooms. I think we should still be measuring square footage. But know that nowadays when you're measuring square footage, if you do it wrong, well, you could get in trouble. There's a lot of disclosures on the MLS listings that says, hey, this is all a guess. If it's important to you, you should get out and measure it. But that doesn't mean it couldn't cause problems down the road. I like to measure because if something's 1,200 square feet, but I measure it and it's 1,400 square feet, well, first I'm going to double and triple check to make sure my math is right. But if I can justify saying it's 1,400 square feet versus 1,200, that might make it worth a little more. But you need to make sure it's worth that much, and you need to be familiar with the square footage rules. Condition report disclosures and extent. We've talked about this in other classes, but make sure, as with your general explanation of the condition report to a seller before they fill it out, let them know about this idea of nature and extent. This is brought up in the inspection contingency. It's commonly thought that, hey, if it's mentioned in the condition report, it can't be objected to as a defect in through the inspection contingency. And that's mostly right, except the inspection contingency references anything you knew the nature and extent of before writing the offer, you can't object to. So if a seller says, minimizes the water problem in the basement, only in super duper big storms, there's a little bit of seepage in the back corner of water in the back corner of the basement. And then the inspector goes down there and says, wow, it looks like this whole basement's been flooded. And it's still damp over here in a different corner. And it's obvious a bigger problem than what was disclosed. Then I would say the nature of the problem was disclosed, but not the extent. And that could very well still be objected to through the inspection contingency. So my recommendation to sellers is, number one, don't minimize anything because they may be doing themselves more harm than good. And also don't make assumptions or diagnoses. Just state the facts. Here's what you know, and that's it. MLS deadlines. Know those deadlines, don't miss them. People are getting fined, so be careful. Don't forget to do the simple things. Yard sign, lockbox, upload your associated docs, brochure box if you do that, Facebook or social media post. All these things that are part of your marketing plan. I would recommend you have some type of listing checklist. It doesn't need to be super fancy, but what do you do for your listings? And in your listing presentations, what are you telling sellers you're going to do? Make sure you do those things. It can be a simple list of 10 items. Here's the things I got to get done. Just make sure you don't forget them. Okay, on the seller listing side, reviewing offers, be nitpicky. Look for those loopholes, especially on the listing side. You know, if you're writing an offer, you're not putting in loopholes, right? And a lot of times the loopholes are not even, another agent writes it, it's a little ambiguous. That a lot of times they're not, most of the time probably, they're not doing it on purpose, but try to look for, boy, what would happen in this scenario and in that scenario. Try to look for the loopholes and then plug them or decide if they need to be plugged. Read through addendum A's very carefully. These are made by brokerages, not the WRA, and different addendums. Different addendum A's have different wording for the different things. Now, be careful you're not practicing law, and really it's hard not to when we're reading forms that are not WRA or state approved forms. But the fact is we do this, but be extra careful. Just don't see in an addendum A, oh, they're using the addendum A inspection contingency. Okay, well, now you need to read through that whole thing. Make sure you understand how that works. Same thing with escalation clauses, any custom written clauses, the inspection, the appraisal buffers. Read through them. Make sure you understand them. Look for the loopholes. Sometimes you need to counter back to just clarify. Some things aren't worth countering back if you just want to plug a loophole. But if you're going to counter back for something else anyways, I would say shore those things up a little bit. With the escalation clause, a common fix, because there's always the concern about, okay, we'll get this accepted, then are we going to run into any misunderstandings with the price gets raised to this much? If you want to avoid that possibility, if you want to avoid having the seller having to email the offer directly to a buyer, you can counter back and say the escalation clause is removed. It's gone, and here's the price. And then you're setting the price at the time of acceptance. That's another way to do it. But again, sometimes you don't want to counter back because you give the buyer a chance to walk away. Allow enough time for performance. We talked about that a little bit just with all the time frames. I recommend using a closing timeline, which is just a list of after acceptance, a summary of the offer and all the deadlines and what needs to be done by what date. A seller closing checklist, just a quick little list to remind buyers and, well, in this case, sellers, remind them what they need to do before closing, because it's pretty simple, but in the midst of moving and all the other stuff going on, it's pretty simple for us, but not for them. So trying to make things easy for them. Working with buyers. Sometimes we write an offer and it doesn't get accepted, and now our buyer is just really mad at us because it's our fault it didn't get accepted. So set the expectation, especially with the new buyer, what the market is like. Tell some stories in general about other buyers and let them know this can be frustrating. And depending on their financing and how competitive they'll be and so forth, have that discussion just so their expectations are set ahead of time. Discuss cost ahead of time, closing costs, but also the cost of the inspection and when that gets paid, radon testing, appraisal cost, or in most cases, a loan origination or application fee, which is used to cover that. Discuss the potential bummers, getting bumped. If they have a home sale contingency, how does that bump process work? What are the options? How can you maybe protect them a little bit from that? The inspection contingency. Talk about the process, the notice, and I like to let them know up front that if we get to a point where you find things wrong, we're going to try to negotiate this with an amendment. If we can't, we need to deliver a notice objecting to defects. When we do that, we're opening up the option for the seller to terminate the deal. So we're really just looking for deal breakers here. But by the way, you may get to a point where you feel it's really fair that the seller should agree to make these repairs. And if they don't, you'll have to decide if you're going to deliver that notice, but know that by doing so, the seller has the right to terminate. If you have that discussion up front, okay, cool. If you wait until the amendment doesn't go through and now it's the day before the deadline and now you're having this discussion, well, now you can't do anything different about it. But if you have that discussion up front and the buyer says, well, I don't want that seller to have the right to kill the deal, there's things you can do to modify that up front. In the market of the last few years, wasn't a good idea to do, but there's ways to do it. Just have those discussions up front because you have more options depending on how your clients react to that. When you go on a showing, look at the condition report ahead of time. Look at the associated docs. Read the write-up. I mean, this all sounds so basic, but when you're in a hurry and you're scrambling and you got 5 showings set up, and are you reading through every condition report ahead of time? I mean, ideally we are, but what you don't want to do is leave the house, then they say write an offer, and you say, oh man, I should have looked at those 4 things on the condition report while we were there, so we could have had an idea if this is really a concern for the buyer or not. Let them know, this is a quick one that you can let a buyer know. When you do your inspection, even if you don't ask for anything, we're required to give a copy of the offer, of the inspection report to the seller. And the reason we are required to do that, not required, I guess if the seller says, I don't want it, well, then we don't have to do it. But it states in the offer that buyer will provide seller with copies of any inspection and testing reports. So if you don't want to do that, that could be lined out. But again, that's a conversation to have. This one usually isn't a big deal, but if ideally you have this discussion with everybody, or somebody who's maybe extra confidential, or somebody or private, or somebody who you think just might not want to do that. Just have that conversation up front. Okay, we're winding down. Two more slides. Another tip, it's not so much about contracts wording or right or wrong. It's about communication, setting expectations, making sure everyone is on the right page. I wish it was just about being right and you could just submit your documents to somebody and get an answer and say who's right and it's binding. But unfortunately, that's what court is. And no, I shouldn't say no one. Rarely does anybody go to court. So it's more important to work with everybody and make sure everybody's on the same page. I can't state that enough. Writing offers, and this is the last slide. Make sure your clients are protected. And where they're not protected, for example, they say, I don't want an inspection. Well, make sure they know the risks. And even better, have them sign something saying they were informed of the risk and they're actively choosing this option. But have those discussions, let them know what the risks are, but let them know I'd like to protect you this way. And if they decide, no, don't put that in there, make our offer more competitive, well, that's fine, but have the discussion. Inspection, asbestos, mold, appraisal buffer, all these things. Appraisal buffer, that can be a big one for second thoughts. Even inspection buffer, if it's a big one, if the appraisal comes in $20,000 low, when you're writing the offer and talking about an appraisal buffer, have that discussion then. How are you going to feel, buyer, if we get the appraisal back and it's $20,000 low? Are you still going to be okay with moving forward, or are you going to feel like you're paying $20,000 too much? I think some would say, no, you put it to them that way. Some would say, no, I don't want to do that. And many these days would say, no, that's fine. I understand that, but at least have that discussion. Use the clause manager. We've got pre-written clauses in there. I mean, certainly you can write your own too, but when you write your own, boy, I mean, sometimes you have to write your own because you have a specific situation, but be nitpicky. Try to look out for those loopholes. Try not to create any loopholes. Use an offer checklist. We talked about that quite a bit in last week's training. And just an offer checklist is every offer you write, you go through this 3-page list and it reminds you on every deal, oh, don't forget this. A lot of it doesn't apply, but hopefully it would be a reminder that something might apply, and then you won't forget it. And then closing timelines and buyer closing checklists again. And that is it. So anybody out there in Zoomer land, any questions, comments, stories?
We didn't have any questions or comments on the social channels or whatever, but thanks, Tim. That was really good. Anybody else here on the Zoom have any live questions before we take off? All right. Seeing and hearing none, I will see you guys all soon. And feel free to comment to questions later on. We can answer these whether we're live here or not by just asking questions in the comments or whatever, no matter which platform you're watching this on. So take care and have a wonderful day. Thanks, Tim.
Yep.